why he sent his vice president there rather than his Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, Marco Rubio. And what the dynamic is that's going on there is when Trump's own son-in-law, Jared Kushner, was sitting next to Vance, and I would not be surprised at all if Trump is asking Kushner on the phone right now, well, how did JD Vance do in these negotiations? So all sorts of complicated factors at play, not least the internal dynamics of the Trump administration. Just again, to get back to your question, I just think that whatever he was seeking in terms of expecting Iran to agree within 24 hours might well have been unrealistic, excuse me.
Right, and if you look at the reaction, this was a reaction, of course, from the U.S., JD Vance talking about no deal. When we look at the Iranian reaction, and especially the Iranian media, so what they have quoted Iran Foreign Minister spokesperson saying that we reached an understanding on a number of issues, but on 2-3 important issues, views were far apart. They've also mentioned that diplomacy never ends. They say that this is a tool for safeguarding national interests. Diplomats must carry out their duty both in times of war and times of peace. So we see this reaction coming on from Iran, but we don't see that reaction coming from U.S. Do you think we still have there is some sort of possibility of talks that Iran has indicated, but U.S. has not?
Yes, I think so. We have to take what Iran says with a grain of salt also. They just look relatively credible compared to all of Trump's bluster and reversals, et cetera, not to mention his constant lying about so many matters. I will express some, if not sympathy, understanding of the Trump administration's perspective on extended negotiations, because it's not really in the administration's interest for the ceasefire to go on and on without some rectification of some of these issues, certainly opening up the Strait of Hormuz. Iran kind of wins by not losing, whereas the U.S. has to get the strait opened, has to reestablish the security of its Gulf Arab allies, if they can still rely on us anymore. And the longer this ceasefire goes on without some kind of resolution, the longer Iran has to rebuild its capacities in terms of missiles or drones or other resources, maybe with the help of Russia and China or other external parties. And the longer the U.S. troops and ships are just sitting there, and you have to rotate troops or you have to rotate ships to some extent, or they become less battle ready after a certain period of time. So I can understand the Trump administration's position or even impatience with not wanting these negotiations to stretch on and on and on. Unfortunately, when we're dealing with some complex issues, sometimes that's a necessity or almost a necessity.
Of course, Strait of Hormuz and the nuclear issue is, of course, one of the sticking points there. But another sticking point was the ceasefire in Lebanon that Iran had raised. Considering the fact that there is a ceasefire still in place and there is expected to be a meeting between Lebanon and Israel in the coming week in the U.S., do you think that there might be a possibility that the Iran-U.S. war could be one of the topics that can be discussed, since U.S. will be, it's happening in U.S.?
Conceivably, although I think a lot of this will be going on a bilateral basis between the U.S. and Iran. But you're quite right to flag the whole issue of the other major war that's going on with between Israel, not Israel and Lebanon per se, but Israel and Hezbollah. And the extent to which the Lebanese government can control Hezbollah is really up in the air, because under an agreement reached last year, the Lebanese government was supposed to disarm Hezbollah. It's shown a lack of will, or more likely a lack of capacity to do so. So what these Israeli-Lebanese government talks will lead to is unclear. And for that matter, with all of these parties, I hate to say this, there's a question of how much we can rely on any of them sticking to their agreements, or how lasting or how powerful those agreements will be. To pick one example, Israel may get an agreement from Hezbollah to step back, or may force Hezbollah to step back to some extent. But Israel pounded and pounded and pounded Gaza for a couple of years, and Hamas still controls, again, about half of Gaza. You have to face the fact that with respect to that particular conflict, Hezbollah and Hamas, as despicable as they may be in some ways, particularly Hamas, given the war crimes it's committed, are ideas, and they're not just a group of people who or forces you can destroy because other people arise to replace them. So that's another complex element, a complexity in this entire dynamic.
Also, when it comes to the regions, the regional parties that are there, the Gulf nations, we know that Pakistan had stepped in for this particular talks. Do you think at this point, considering the fact that this could escalate even further global economic concerns, do you think regional countries like, for example, Oman, who were part of the peace, the talks before, do you think these countries might step in to become the next countries where these two parties, Iran and US, can hold talks in the future?
It's certainly conceivable. Oman had some credibility to act as an intermediary before, so it could act as an intermediary again. Its perspective on doing so may be somewhat different, given all the fighting and destruction that's gone on, especially in its neighboring Gulf Arab countries. But it may well be willing to do this out of self-interest and out of the interest in establishing peace generally. It wouldn't surprise me if there were another round coming up. Of course, the big X factor here is two big X factors are that Trump himself is unpredictable, and what happens with Israel and Lebanon is unpredictable. I think the U.S. does have the capacity to say to Israel, no, you've got to stop. We want you to stop, as a way of helping us to reach some kind of an agreement or extended ceasefire with Iran. But so far, Trump and the U.S. have been unwilling or unable to do so.
Right. And that is when JD Vance, when he says that we cannot get to a situation where Iran could agree to U.S. terms, it's interesting because that's exactly why this meeting was held, for them to actually agree on this and these very contentious topics. What could have actually made U.S. terms so, convincing for Iran to agree upon?
You mean so difficult for them to agree?
Yeah, so no, absolutely. What could have been the offer when Vance says that was the best offer they gave? What could have been the best offer for Iran to accept?
I think the U.S. wants Iran to completely give up any claim on its nuclear materials, including those that it currently has. I think if it's it's ironic, it's conceivable. That if the U.S. had said to Iran, among other things, we're going to let you hold on to that nuclear material as long as it is inspected in some way, which had been the situation for a number of years under the Obama agreement. We're going to allow you some control over the Strait of Hormuz, along with maybe some other parties, maybe even including the U.S., that might have been something that Iran might have agreed to, as long as it could retain some control, including what it may be doing now, which is charging $1 million or $2 million per ship passing through, which is a tremendous source of potential revenue for it. So I think there might be some room for compromise here along those lines. But and other thing the U.S. could have offered Iran, that Iran definitely wants, is for Israel to stop its military operations in Lebanon. But whether any of those would really be acceptable to Iran in the end, I think these two parties just started off these negotiations very, very far apart. And if they can bridge their gap at all, it's going to take far more than 24 hours of talks.
And these are very interesting points, because the nuclear weapons. So when Vance said that the U.S. demanded a fundamental commitment that Iran won't develop nuclear weapons, and anything that allows them to have nuclear weapons, which can consist of uranium enrichment. And given that Iran's consistent denial of nuclear ambitions, they never said that they want nuclear weapons. They said they want it for civilian purposes. Do you think that demand was actually negotiable? And on the part of Strait of Hormuz, U.S. had offered a joint effort into controlling the Strait of Hormuz. The fact that Iran took that as a leverage for this war, do you think these two points could have been a point of negotiation for Iran?
Well, a point of negotiation, but a point of agreement. It sounds like the two sides are just too far apart. And if anything, one of the many ironic outcomes of this war, two of them we've already discussed or are acknowledge that Iran now controls the Strait of Hormuz, whereas before that was not an issue before this war started. But the second ironic outcome is that Iran now has a tremendous incentive to develop nuclear weapons, one way or another, because that's the real protection that Iran has against U.S. future U.S. assaults or maybe Israeli assaults if it has nuclear weapons that it could use. That's what's protected North Korea all these years. They've got an incredible rogue regime that's made probably the worst government on earth to its own people and is dangerous by virtue of having its nuclear weapons, but that's what's protected them against the U.S. or other forces attacking them. In retrospect, one of the mistakes Ukraine made, not that you could fault them because it was made with good intentions, was when the Soviet Union broke up, Ukraine gave up its own the nuclear weapons it controlled. There was a treaty signed, a non-aggression treaty that Russia guaranteed that, among other things, was in return for Ukraine giving up its nuclear weapons that it controlled years ago. And I bet Ukraine wishes that it had nuclear weapons now, not to use them, but because it could have been a real deterrence against the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So if anything, Iran has a stronger incentive now to, by hook or by crook, whether in a year or whether over the course of 10 years, to acquire nuclear weapons.
Right. Well, the 21 hours of negotiation did not yield any deal, but we still have the ceasefire, which still exists, and we'll have to wait and see how long, if that could be extended, and any other talks that we can expect in the coming weeks. Thank you so much for joining us on the broadcast and giving your insights, Mr. Golub.
Always good to be here. Thank you.